So chapter 15 is called My Dogs Smell Meat. Anne-Marie's mind raced. She remembered what her mother had said. If anyone stops you, you must pretend to be nothing more than a silly little girl. She stared at the soldiers. She remembered how she had stared at the others, frightened, when they had stopped her on the street. Christy hadn't been frightened. Christy had been, well, nothing more than a silly little girl, angered because the soldiers had touched her hair that afternoon. She had known nothing of danger, and the soldiers had been amused by her. Anne-Marie willed herself with all her being to behave as Christy would. "Good morning," she said carefully to the soldiers. They looked her up and down in silence. Both dogs were tense and alert. The two soldiers had held the leashes, wore thick gloves. "What are you doing here?" one of them asked. Anne-Marie held out her basket with a thick loaf of bread visible. "My Uncle Henrik forgot his lunch, and I'm taking it to him. He's a fisherman." The soldiers were looking around. Their eyes glanced behind her and scanned the bushes on either side. "Are you alone?" they asked. Anne-Marie nodded. "Yes," she said. One of the dogs growled, but she noticed that both dogs were looking at the lunch basket. Hold on. One soldier stepped forward. The other and the two holding the dogs remained where they were. "You came out before daybreak just to bring a lunch? Why doesn't your uncle eat fish?" What would Christy reply? Anne-Marie tried to giggle, the way her sister might. "Uncle Henrik doesn't even like fish," she said, laughing. "He says he sees too much of it and smells too much of it. Anyway, he wouldn't eat it raw." She made a face. "Well, I suppose he would if he were starving, but Uncle Henrik always has bread and cheese for lunch." Keep chattering, she told herself, as Christy would, a silly little girl. "I like fish," she went on. "I like it the way my mother cooks it. Sometimes she rolls it up in breadcrumbs and—" The soldier reached forward and grabbed the crisp loaf of bread from the basket. He examined it carefully. Then he broke it in half, pulling the two halves apart with his fists. That would enrage Christy, she knew. "Don't," she said angrily. "That's Uncle Henrik's bread. My mother baked it." The soldier ignored her. He tossed the two halves of the loaf to the ground, one half in front of each dog. They consumed it, each snapping at the bread and gulping at it so it was gone in an instant. "Have you seen anyone in the woods?" The soldier barked a question at her. "No, only you." Anne-Marie stared at him. "What are you doing in the woods anyway? You're making me late. Uncle Henrik's boat will leave before I get there with his lunch, or what's left of his lunch." The soldier picked up the wedge of cheese. He turned it over in his hand. He turned to the three behind him and asked them something in their own language. One of them answered, "Neen," in a bored tone. Anne-Marie recognized the word. The man had replied, "No." He had probably been asked, Anne-Marie thought, "Do you want this? Or perhaps, should I give this to the dogs?" The soldier continued to hold the cheese. He tossed it back and forth between his hands. Anne-Marie gave an exasperated sigh. "Could I go now, please?" she said impatiently. The soldier reached for the apple. He noted its brown spots and made a face in disgust. "No meat?" he asked, glancing at the basket and the napkin that lay in the bottom. Anne-Marie gave him a withering look. "You know we have no meat," she said. "Your army eats all of Denmark's meat." "Please, please," she implored in her mind, "don't lift the napkin." The soldier laughed. He dropped the bruised apple to the ground. One of the dogs leaned forward, pulling at his leash, sniffing the apple, and stepped back. But both dogs still looked intently at the basket, their ears alert, their mouths open. Saliva glistened on their smooth pink gums. "My dogs smell meat," the soldier said. "They smell squirrel in the woods," Anne-Marie responded. "You should take them hunting." The soldier reached forward with the cheese in one hand, as if he were going to return it to the basket, but he didn't. Instead, he pulled out the flowered cotton napkin. Anne-Marie froze. "Your uncle has a pretty little lunch," the soldier said scornfully, crumpling a napkin. "Like a woman," he added, with contempt. Then his eyes locked on the basket. He handed the cheese and napkin to the soldier beside him. "What's this, there in the bottom?" he asked in a different, tenser tone. What would Christy do? Anne-Marie stamped her foot. Suddenly, to her own surprise, she began to cry. "I don't know," she said, her voice choked. "My mother's going to be angry that you stopped me and made me late, and you've completely ruined Uncle Henrik's lunch, so now he'll be mad at me too." The dogs whined and struggled against the leashes. Nosing forward to the basket, one of the other soldiers muttered something in German. The soldier took out the packet. "Why is this so carefully hidden?" he snapped. Anne-Marie wiped her eyes on the sleeves of her sweater. "It wasn't hidden any more than the napkin was. I don't know what it is." That, she realized, was true. She had no idea what was in the packet. The soldier tore the paper open while below him on the ground, the dogs strained and snarled, pulling against their leashes. Their muscles were visible beneath the sleek, short-haired flesh. He looked inside, then glared at Anne-Marie. "Stop crying, you girl," he said harshly. "Your mother has sent your uncle a handkerchief. In Germany, the women have better things to do. They don't stay at home hemming handkerchiefs for their men." He gestured with the folded white cloth and gave a short laugh. "At least she didn't stitch flowers on it." He flung it to the ground, still half wrapped in the paper, beside the apple. The dogs lunged, sniffed at it eagerly, then subsided, disappointed again. "Go on," the soldier said. He dropped the cheese and the napkin back in the basket. "Go on to your uncle and tell him the German dogs enjoyed his bread." All of the soldiers pushed past her. One of them laughed, and they spoke to each other in their own language. In a moment, they had disappeared down the path in the direction from which Anne-Marie had just come. Quickly, she picked up the apple and the opened packet with the white handkerchief inside. She put them in the basket and ran around the bend toward the harbor, where the morning sky was now bright with early sun, and some of the boat engines were starting. The Ingeborg was still there by the dock, and Uncle Henrik was there, his light hair wind-blown and bright as he knelt by the nets. Anne-Marie called him, and he came to the side, his face worried when he recognized her on the dock. She handed the basket across. "Mama sent your lunch," she said, quavering, "but soldiers stopped me and they took your bread." She didn't dare to tell him more. Henrik quickly glanced into the basket. She could see the look of relief on his face and knew it was there because he saw that the packet was there, even though it was torn open. "Thank you," he said, and the relief was evident in his voice. Anne-Marie looked quickly around at the familiar boat. She could see down the passageway into the empty cabin. There was no sign of the Rosens or the others. Uncle Henrik followed her eyes and her puzzled look. "All is well," he said softly. "Don't worry. Everything is all right." "I wasn't sure," he said, "but now," he eyed the basket in his hands, "because of you, Anne-Marie, everything is all right. You run home now and tell your mama not to worry. I will see you this evening." He grinned at her suddenly. "They took my bread, huh? I hope they choke on it." Chapter 16. I will tell you just a little. "Poor Blossom," Uncle Henrik said, laughing, after dinner that evening. "It was bad enough that your mother was going to milk her after all these years of city life, but Anne-Marie, to do it for the very first time? I'm surprised Blossom didn't kick you." I think that's their cow. Mama laughed too. She sat in a kitchen chair that Uncle Henrik had moved from the living room and placed in a corner of the kitchen. Her leg, in a clean white cast on the floor, was on a footstool. Anne-Marie didn't mind their laughing. It had been funny. When she had arrived back at the farmhouse, she had run along the road to avoid the soldiers who might still be in the woods now. Carrying nothing, she was in no danger. Mama and Christy were gone. There was a note hastily written from Mama that the doctor was taking her in his car to the local hospital, and that they'd be back soon. But the noise from Blossom, forgotten, unmilked, uncomfortable in the barn, had sent Anne-Marie wearily out with a milking bucket. She had done her best, trying to ignore Blossom's irritated snorts and tossing head, remembering how Uncle Henrik's hands had worked with a firm, rhythmic pulling motion. And she had milked. "I could have done it," Christy announced. "You only have to pull and squirt it out. I could do it easily." Anne-Marie rolled her eyes. "I'd like to see you try," she thought. "Is Ellen coming back?" Christy asked, forgetting the cow after a moment. "She said she could make a dress for my doll." "Anne-Marie and I will help you make a dress," Mama told her. "Ellen had to go with her parents. Wasn't that a nice surprise that the Rosens came last night to get her?" "She should have woken me up to say goodbye," Christy grumbled, spooning some imaginary food into the painted mouth of the doll she had propped up next to her. "Anne-Marie," Uncle Henrik said, getting up from the table and pushing back his chair, "if you come with me now to the barn, I'll give you a milking lesson. Wash your hands first." Me too, said Christy. Not you too, Mama said. Not this time. I need your help here since I can't walk very well. You'll have to be my nurse. Christy hesitated, deciding whether to argue. Then she said, I'm going to be a nurse when I grow up, not a cow milker, so I have to stay here and take care of Mama. Followed as usual by the kitten, Anne-Marie walked with Uncle Henrik to the barn through a fine misty rain that had begun to fall. It seemed to her that Blossom shook her head happily when she saw Henrik and knew that she would be in good hands again. She sat on the stacked hay and watched while he milked, but her mind was not on milking. Uncle Henrik, she asked, where are the Rosens and the others? I thought you were taking them to Sweden on your boat, but they weren't there. They were there, he told her, leaning forward against the cow's broadside. You should know this. You remember that I told you it was safer not to know. Oh, I'm sorry. You shouldn't know this. You remember I told you it was safer not to know. But, he went on, I will tell you just a little bit because you were so very brave. Brave? Anne-Marie asked, surprised. No, I wasn't. I was very frightened. You risked your life. But I didn't even think about it. I was only thinking of... He interrupted her, smiling. That's all that brave means. Not thinking about the dangers. Just thinking about what you must do. Of course you were frightened. I was too today. But you kept your mind on what you had to do. So did I. Now let me tell you about the Rosens. Many of the fishermen have built hidden places in their boats. I have too, down underneath. I only have to lift the boards in the right place, and there is room to hide a few people. Peter and the others in the Resistance who work with him bring them to me and to the other fishermen as well. There are people who hide them and help them along the way to Galilee. Anne-Marie was startled. Peter's in the Resistance? Of course! I should have known. He brings Mama and Papa the secret newspaper, De Freie Dansk, and he always seems to be on the move. I should have figured it out myself. He is a very, very brave young man, Uncle Henrik said. They all are. Anne-Marie frowned, remembering the empty boat that morning. Were the Rosens and the others there then, underneath, when I brought the basket? Uncle Henrik nodded. I heard nothing, Anne-Marie said. Of course not. They had to be absolutely quiet for many hours. The baby was drugged so that it couldn't wake and cry. Could they hear me when I talked to you? Yes. Your friend Ellen told me later that they heard you, and they heard the soldiers who came to search the boat. Anne-Marie's eyes widened. Soldiers came? She asked. I thought they went the other way after they stopped me. There are many soldiers in Gili and all along the coast. They are searching all the boats now. They know that the Jews are escaping, but they are not sure how, and they rarely find them. The hiding places are carefully concealed, and we often pile dead fish on the deck as well. They hate getting their shiny boots dirty. He turned his head towards her and grinned. Anne-Marie remembered the shiny boots confronting her on the dark path. Uncle Henrik, she said, I'm sure you're right that I shouldn't know everything, but please, would you tell me about that handkerchief? I knew it was important, the packet, and that's why I ran through the woods to take it to you. But I thought maybe it was a map. How could a handkerchief be important? He set the filled pail aside and began to wash the cow's udder with the damp cloth. Very few people know about this, Anne-Marie, he said with a serious look. But the soldiers are so angry about the escaping Jews and the fact that they can't find them that they are starting to use trained dogs. They had dogs, the ones who stopped me on the path. Uncle Henrik nodded. The dogs are trained to sniff about and find where people are hidden. It happened just yesterday on 2 boats. Those dogs, they go right through dead fish to the human scent. We were all very, very worried. We thought it meant the end of the escape to Sweden by boat. It was Peter who took the problem to scientists and doctors. Some very fine minds have worked night and day to find a solution, and they have created a special drug. I don't know what it is, but it is in the handkerchief. It attracts the dogs, but when they sniff it, it ruins their sense of smell. Imagine that. Anne-Marie remembered how the dogs had lunged at the handkerchief, smelled it, and then turned away. Now, thanks to Peter, we will each have a handkerchief, each boat captain. When the soldiers board the boats, we will simply pull the handkerchief out of our pockets. The Germans will probably think we have bad colds. The dogs will sniff about, sniff the handkerchiefs we're holding, roam the boat, and find nothing. They'll smell nothing. Did they bring dogs to your boat this morning? Yes, about 20 minutes after you had gone. I was about to pull away from the dock when the soldiers appeared and ordered me to halt. They came aboard, searched, and found nothing. By then, of course, I had the handkerchief. If I had not, well, his voice trailed off, and he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. If she had not found the packet where Mr. Rosen had dropped it, if she had not run through the woods, if the soldiers had taken the basket, if she had not reached the boat in time, all of the ifs whirled in Anne-Marie's head. They are safe in Sweden now, she asked. You sure? Uncle Henrik stood and patted the cow's head. I saw them ashore. There were people waiting to take them to shelter. They are quite safe there. But what if the Nazis invade Sweden? Will the Rosens have to run away again? That won't happen. For reasons of their own, the Nazis want Sweden to remain free. It's very complicated. Anne-Marie's thoughts began to turn to her friends, hiding under the deck of the Ingelborg. It must have been awful for them. So many hours there, she murmured. Was it dark in the hiding place? Dark and cold, and very cramped. And Mrs. Rosen was seasick, even though we were not on the water very long. It's a short distance, you know. But they are courageous people, and none of that matters when they stepped ashore. The air was fresh and cool in Sweden. The wind was blowing. The baby was beginning to wake as I said goodbye to them. I wonder if I will ever see Ellen again, Anne-Marie said sadly. You will, little one. You saved her life, after all. Someday you will find her again. Someday the war will end, Uncle Henrik said. All wars do. Now then, he said, stretching. That was quite a milking lesson, was it not? Uncle Henrik, Anne-Marie shrieked, and then began to laugh. Look! The god of thunder has fallen into the milk pail. Chapter 17. All this long time. The war would end. Uncle Henrik had said that, and it was true. The war ended almost 2 long years later. Anne-Marie was 12. Church bells rang all over Copenhagen early that May evening. The Danish flag was raised everywhere. People stood in the streets and wept as they sang the national anthem of Denmark. Anne-Marie stood on the balcony of the apartment with her parents and sister and watched. Up and down the streets and across the other side, she could see flags and banners in almost every window. She knew that many of those apartments were empty. For nearly 2 years now, neighbors had tended the plants, dusted the furniture, and polished the candlesticks for the Jews who had fled. Her mother had done so for the Rosens. It is what friends do, Mama had said. Now, neighbors had entered each unoccupied waiting apartment, opened a window, and hung a symbol of freedom there. This evening, Mrs. Johansson's face was wet with tears. Christy, waving a small flag, sang. Her blue eyes were bright. Even Christy was growing up. No longer was she a light-hearted chatterbox of a child. Now she was taller, more serious, and very thin. She looked like the pictures of Lise at 7 in the photo album. Peter Nielsen was dead. It was a painful fact to recall on this day when there was so much joy in Denmark. But Anne-Marie forced herself to think of the red-headed, almost brother, and how devastating the day was when they received news that Peter had been captured and executed by the Germans in the public square in Copenhagen. He had written a short letter to them from prison the night before. It had said simply that he loved them, that he was not afraid, and that he was proud to have done what he could for his country, and for the sake of all free people. He had asked in the letter to be buried next to Lise. But even that was not to be for Peter. The Nazis refused to return the bodies of the young men they had taken. They simply buried them there where they were killed and marked the graves only with numbers. Later, Anne-Marie had gone to the place with her parents, and they had laid flowers there on the numbered ground. That night, Anne-Marie's parents told her the truth about Lisa's death at the beginning of the war. She was part of the resistance, too, Papa had explained. Part of the group that fought for our country in whatever way they could. We didn't know, Mama added. She didn't tell us. Peter told us after she died. Oh, Papa, Anne-Marie cried. Mama. She wanted to know what happened, wanted to know it all, but it wasn't certain that she could bear the knowledge. Papa shook his head. She was with Peter and others in a cellar, where they held secret meetings to make plans. Somehow the Nazis found out, and they raided the place that evening. They all ran different ways, trying to escape. Some of them were shot, Mama told her sadly. Peter was shot in the arm. Do you remember that Peter's arm was bandaged in a sling at Lisa's funeral? He wore a coat over it so that no one would notice, and a hat to hide his red hair. The Nazis were looking for him. Anne-Marie didn't remember. She hadn't noticed. The whole day had been a blur of grief. But what about Lise, she asked. What happened? From the military car, they saw her running and simply ran her down. It was true, what you said, that she was hit by a car. It was true, Papa told her. They were all so young, Mama said, shaking her head. She blinked, closed her eyes for a moment, and took a deep breath. So very, very young, with so much hope. Now remembering Lise, Anne-Marie looked from the balcony down into the street. She saw that below, amid the music, singing, and the sound of the church bells, people were dancing. It brought back another memory, the memory of Lise so long ago, wearing the yellow dress, dancing with Peter the night they announced their engagement. She turned and went to her bedroom where the blue trunk still stood in the corner as it had all these years. Opening it, Anne-Marie saw that the yellow dress had begun to fade. It was discolored at the edges where it had lain so long in folds. Carefully, she spread open the skirt of the dress and found the place where Ellen's necklace lay hidden in the pocket. The little Star of David still gleamed gold. Papa, she said, returning to the balcony where her father was standing with the others, watching the rejoicing crowd. She opened her hand and showed him the necklace. Can you fix this? I've kept it all this long time. It was Ellen's. Her father took it from her and examined the broken clasp. Yes, he said, I can fix it. When the Rosens come home, you can give it back to Ellen. Until then, Anne-Marie told him, I will wear it myself.